But you haven't actually been sitting at that piano quite as much as I had previously thought, had you? There have been times when Adrian has been left to practice while you have gone and done something else. And of course, I'm not counting the times you must have come here with no intention of going near that piano at all. Possibly even running straight upstairs after letting yourself in? Randall selected a Yale key from the bunch he had retrieved from Julian's jacket pocket. I presume she gave it to you? It does fit the back door perfectly. It's not what you think, Julian spluttered. Oh, isn't it? You mean you haven't been seeing my wife on a regular basis with the intention of making her feel, shall we say, a little happier? She was the one who suggested it, the music teacher spluttered as panic began to take hold. My dear fellow, it matters not a jot to me who started it, but that you were instrumental in it happening at all. It does, after all, take two to tango. I do hope you appreciate the trouble I've gone to there to include a little musical pun. But enough of this. I am a very busy man, so I think it's time we started to take things a little more seriously. Randall turned to pick something up from the bench. As he did so, Julian strained to see the items on it. He caught sight of a number of tools, knives, and something in a tall glass jar, which he could have sworn wriggled a little before Randall demanded his attention once again. The older man held up the pair of large pliers he had selected in one hand, and what Julian presumed was a chicken bone in the other. I don't do much DIY myself, but it's useful to have a few tools around the house, don't you think? Randall said, as he placed the finger-sized bone between its jaws and showed just how little strength he needed to apply to crunch the grey-white ivory into a pinkish pulp. Just in case you have any little jobs that need taking care of. The older man shook the remains of the bone free from the pliers and allowed them to fall to the ground. He took a few steps towards Julian's quivering form. I was made to have piano lessons once, you know, he said. Couldn't stand them. Teacher's name was Mrs. Glossop, and she looked exactly like her surname might imply. All rolls of fat and tiny rimless spectacles hiding even tinier eyes. He held up his own right hand to regard it as he continued. You know, she had the most grotesque, greasy, pudgy fingers that she would put over mine to try and improve my fingering. You know, it was all I could do to stop myself vomiting all over the sleeves of one of those hideous hand-knitted cardigans she wore, whatever the weather. And if that wasn't bad enough, every time I knocked on her front door for the lesson that I was dreading anyway, the two huge black dogs she owned would come galloping up and make such a noise behind the wood panelling that it was all I could do not to turn and run all the way home. Where, of course, my mother would have sent me straight back with a thick ear. So you could say I have learned to dislike music teachers from an early age. And therefore, I have had many, many years to devise some very particular ways of making members of your particular profession suffer. He was inches from Julian now. And do you know what I used to do when I got home from those dreadful music lessons? He said, his voice quieter now he was nearer his subject, but all the more terrifying for it. I used to read. Oh, and not just any story. Boy's own stuff, Enid Blyton, and any crap like that. Oh no. I used to read horror stories. The more gruesome, the better. There was one particular series from a British publisher that I used to love. In fact, I have a full set of all 30 volumes upstairs. Not that you're going to get to see them. They're far too fine a collector's item for the likes of you to be allowed to get their grubby little fingers on. Anyway, in one particular story, someone ties up a horror writer and subjects him to all sorts of dreadful things. Cuts his arms off, pops out one of his eyes, and tapes a commentary of what he's doing the entire time. Appalling stuff and not terribly well written, I realise now, but nevertheless, it stayed with me. Despite Julian's attempts to pull away, he was powerless to prevent Randall place the jaws of the pliers either side of his little finger. The young man gasped as he felt the serrated edges grip his skin. I suppose losing any finger would be disastrous for someone like you, Randall said. But if I'm going to spend some of my valuable time on you, I suppose I ought to make it really count. He relaxed the instrument, only to move it so that now the fingernail on the soft pulp of Julian's right index finger was in its grasp. After all, an index finger is far more important to anyone, said Randall, as he ever so slightly tightened his grip. And when I think of where that finger might have been, well, I'm sure you can understand why I might have something against it, other than the pliers which I'm currently holding at the moment. As Randall's pressure on the plier handles increased, so did the biting pain in Julian's finger, building in intensity until he was sure the pulpy flesh of the tip would burst. Just as the music teacher braced himself for the inevitable crushing pain that was to come, the grip relaxed. Yes, I thought of crushing part of you, said Randall, backing away. But then I remembered another more horrible way that I could have revenge. He straightened up and went back to the workbench. Julian looked down at his finger and breathed a sigh of relief as he realised that while it was reddened and bruised, there didn't seem to be any serious damage. Have you read any horror stories, Mr. Partleton? Randall still had his back to him. Julian shook his head before realising that his captor couldn't see him. No, he croaked. That's a pity, was the reply, because maybe if you had, you would know what I intended to do with this, and that would make your terror all the greater. Randall pulled on a pair of heavy gloves, picked up the glass jar, and turned to face Julian once more. Julian peered at what it contained. A slight serpentine shape flipped from side to side as Randall brought it closer, so that now Julian could see that the shape possessed many pairs of legs and two whip-like antennae, and a pair of curved, clacking mandibles. There's another story in one of those books where a cuckolded man in Borneo takes revenge on his wife's lover by placing a large earwig into his ear. The creature then proceeds to eat through the poor chap's brain and lays clutches of eggs inside his head so the bastard has no hope of surviving. He held the glass jar close to Julian's face. I couldn't get one of those earwigs, but I understand that the pain inflicted by the bite of this South American centipede is severe enough to make a man want to cut his own arm off rather than bear it. Of course, it's not your arm that I'm going to drop it onto. I think it would be more appropriately placed somewhere a little more relevant to the crime you have committed against me. Don't you? He looked down at Julian's lap and began to unscrew the lid of the jar, shaking the container as he did so to further agitate the creature. As its head bumped against the side, the creature tried to stab at the glass with needle-sharp mandibles, leaving streaks of dirty green fluid where it tried to bite at the walls of its prison. Randall reached in and picked the thing up by the tail, taking care to hold the squirming creature tightly. He walked up to Julian and held the centipede an inch from Julian's left eye. Losing an eye wouldn't be very nice either, would it? He said. Almost as bad as losing your fingers. Of course, if this little fellow were to plunge those rather nasty-looking pincers into your socket, the poison would very quickly travel to your brain and you would be dead in moments. Whereas, if we were to assist it in injecting the poison a little further away, then you will have all the longer to regret your decision to show my wife the finer points of your fingering.